Well, let's continue our discussion now and focus on the next topic, which is an examination of this question about whether or not and how we can go about raising the age of criminal responsibility. And I'm really delighted to welcome Associate Professor Jeremy Pritchard to this discussion. Those of you who've submitted questions would already recognise Jeremy. Jeremy delivered a wonderful recorded presentation about this issue. Jeremy is a long-term lecturer in criminal law and criminal responsibility here at the University of Tasmania. Jeremy has wide-ranging research interests, including in relation to online offending and situational offending. But his interests are, I think, very broad, and he has a whole range of perspectives relating to youth offending in particular. So welcome, Jeremy. Lovely to see you online.
Thank you, Jan. Lovely to see you as well. You're not across the hall, by the way, in your office, are you?
No, I'm not.
That's good.
We've got about 17 schools online at the moment. And from what I can gather, there's somewhere between 15 and 30 students in each class. So
that's fantastic.
Quite terrific outreach today to students from across the state. I hope that you're all enjoying the gorgeous weather that southern Tasmania is today and preparing for tomorrow. We got some, I think, really great questions for your topic.
We do.
Starting with some really sort of logical questions about the how. How do we actually go about raising the age of criminal responsibility in both legislative terms, but also sort of in political terms? Do you want to just kick off by answering your thoughts on the process that would be used to raise the age?
Jan, yeah, I'd love this first question to start big before we drill down into other issues. I think I might park the kind of more of the political aspect about how to do it, because the process would be similar to other political movements or attempts by the community or society to bring issues to the attention of the Parliament and government. But I think what I'd like us to maybe think about is something kind of that's relevant and under the umbrella of politics, but it's more about the nuts and bolts of what, on the face of it, seems like a relatively simple change. Well, what does it require? What would it require the machinery of government to do? So all the different departments, how would they have to address something like this? Because as you can, as the students would have seen, and the slides that I used are presented, I showed them the relevant section from our criminal code, section 18.1, which is blissfully simple. It just basically says anyone under the age of 10 is not criminally responsible for anything. So we'd be tempted to think, well, surely then all we need to do is put a good case to the parliamentarians, drawing on some of the issues I brought up in the slides, but, with a lot more detail, of course, and just say, look, all you need to do is actually change one digit in the code. You don't even have to get rid of, there's the 1 and the 0, which says that it's 10 at the moment. All you need to do is delete the 0 and put in a 4, and Bob's your uncle. Well, things like this, as I'm sure the students are well aware, not just from the area of criminal law, but all sorts of areas of law, they're integrated, aren't they? And so even just from looking at our slides and the brief overview I gave of some of the key features of the criminal law and how it operates for young people in Tasmania, we could see that, all right, if we change the criminal code, section 18.1, we're going to have to make amendments to the Youth Justice Act, because that has a lot in there about that age group, 10 to 13. But then, of course, there'll be a lot of other legislation that will need to be examined. Think all of the different legislation that might govern police powers of arrest, and the current rules about how young people can be detained and taken in police custody. And there'll be many other implications that have to be examined. So without making the topic boring, I want to just point out that you'd make one little change like this, but it's going to be connected to lots of other different things. And what to get across to the students, every system in every jurisdiction in Tasmania, in Australia, I think of the 8 jurisdictions if you include the Commonwealth, will have their own integrated system that's different. So it's not like we have one change. You can say, oh, everybody, all of us just need to do this, and then we're all on the same page. They have to look at how all of their connections are made.
Yeah, so there's obviously an easy answer and a difficult answer.
Yeah.
What are the barriers? Are there any reasons why a state or a territory would resist this initiative?
Yeah, Jan, I know that you and I have shared literature just on this topic because it's so important to so many things, and that is relates to how to interpret inactivity by government when it seems apparent that there's a good case for change. And in short, we can think of, among other, you could go into more detail on this. Of course, you could interpret inactivity as meaning that the government is opposed to something like raising the age of criminal responsibility. That's one possibility. I don't mean in Tasmania, I mean in any jurisdiction. Of course, another option is that it is disinterested, not uninterested. It just feels it's got more than enough other stuff to do, and that maybe this isn't a priority. Or another option is that the government is interested, it is not opposed, but the machinery of government is examining for the particular jurisdictions what the implication of the change might mean. So that I refer to all the different types of things I discussed just above. So unexpected complexity may be the cause for delay. So that's one kind of point I want to make. Don't assume that that there's opposition to it. It's just that they have to be careful. You'd want them to be careful. But for the students' interest, I think it's really nice to be able to give you something very local about what's going on in Tasmania. The Tasmanian government has requested that the Tasmanian Law Reform Institute examine this exact topic. And lo and behold, from talking to the TLRI on this topic, of course, this started, as they've gone further into it, started uncovering unexpected complexity. Here's 2 examples of unexpected complexity. Remember that the essence of raising the age of criminal responsibility from 10 to 13 is a statement of not just the criminal justice system, but the whole of society, a strong statement of policy that a person who's under the age of 14, really, we just cannot, stronger than Dolly Incapax and the presumption that I described earlier. It's a strong policy statement that, as a strong rule, we're going to assume that young people, those aged 10 to 13, cannot understand the implications of crimes, and so they shouldn't be culpable. So let's think, for example, what that means for a 13-year-old. They couldn't understand the implication of, for example, stealing a car. That means they can't get their mind around, one way of interpreting the law is that criminal law is saying that they just won't really understand how it hurts other people if you steal their car, etc., etc. You see what I'm driving at. They they won't understand the full moral or ethical implications of that act. Okay. One of the things the TLRO is considering is what that might mean for evidence law when you're thinking about all of the rules that relate to child witnesses. And could this change in policy be used by a defence team in the right criminal trial to say, wait a minute, we need to really look at the rules pertaining to, say, this 13-year-old witness, because if we've, here's the kind of policy tension I want to drive at. It just wouldn't be exactly what they'd argue, but if we're to assume that a 13-year-old can't understand the implications of stealing a car or any other, think of less serious offences if you like, how can we expect them as a witness to understand the consequences of the testimony they're about to give if the testimony is inaccurate or if they lie? Someone might go to jail for a long time, depending on the seriousness of the trial. So there's a little bubble. Now, I'm not saying for a moment that these things aren't, they're not surmountable, but it's an example of, wow, this is all a bit more complicated than we thought, and there's good reasons for care. Think of also possible implications for medical and health policy. And this is really interesting because it relates, Jan, to one of the questions that I saw was coming up about agency. Great use of word, agency in relation to young Indigenous people. Again, same type of reasoning, but with a different slant. What are the implications if we say criminal law, or anyone under the age of 14, 10 to 13, they really can't understand things like the implications of stealing a TV or a car or punching someone in the mouth, or, think of all the different varieties of criminal behaviours that are governed. What does that mean for what used to be called Gillick competence, or what does that mean for their competence to make decisions about their health, risky medical treatment or surgery or something that might have either a time-limited risk or a permanent influence on their health? So I'm thinking that, and this is just my opinion, one of the barriers is not insurmountable for raising the age of criminal responsibility, but we're going to, a barrier to getting it done will be carefully looking at all of these different issues.
So it's not so much that it's a barrier, it just is, it's not as easy as it first looks, because there are these other possible indirect effects or consequences of doing it. Yep, it's a really interesting, interesting perspective.
Yep.
Let me go to that question that you just alluded to, because I agree with you that I thought this was a really sophisticated question that we received from one of the schools. And again, I apologise, I don't know which school actually submitted this question, but the question that was put was that alternatives to criminal justice it necessitate or imply a significant involvement from welfare agencies in the lives of families that we might class as at risk, potentially over a prolonged period of time. And there is a real risk that this can undermine the agency of groups of people. And the question was, are we at risk of creating further opportunities for institutionalized abuse by requiring families of young people who are at risk from being subjected to these sort of welfarist interventions?
Yeah, it's an awesome question, and it's what I kind of flagged as a personal concern in the last slide of my presentation, Jan. And it's based on my PhD was on restorative justice and youth offending in, this was 20 years ago, but in Tasmania. And during that process, I looked at the history of youth justice in Australia across the 20th century. And you see mistakes going one way or the other. But there's something that I'm really pleased that I'm particularly pleased that comes out of my, this question. And that is, this is the most important response I can give. We do not have to assume that raising the age of criminal responsibility to 14 means that any agencies need to rush in. So there does not, that's, I think, would be one of the most important points for policymakers and practitioners to be thinking about. That just because we have made this change, we do not need, we should not assume that there needs to be a flood of other agencies outside of the criminal justice system that now have to rush in and do stuff. And this kind of relates to one of the later questions, the next question about evidence, but the best evidence that we have about youth crime and the profiles of offending that cuts across not just states and territories, but across countries and across time is that the bulk of young offenders are just going to grow out of it. It's called the maturation effect. And now you will have, they might officially, I don't want to repeat the slides that I walked through with the students earlier, but you will have always, the typical pattern is a small group, maybe 5% sometimes of young offenders who account for the bulk of offending by minors, like as much as 60%. So let's set that group aside, and that's where you see the absolute catalogue of risk factors, just everything you can expect relating to poverty and school life and upbringing, et cetera, and abuse and so forth. But really, when we're talking about the numbers of people, the bulk of young people who offend actually just grow out of it. That's why there was this idea a few decades ago of radical non-interventionism, which is just do nothing. I'm not necessarily suggesting that. But I do think it is very logical, and in fact, I'd strongly argue that we need to guard against an assumption that other agencies need to do anything else. Right, so that's just a point to make. I do think getting to how do we, now, of course, there will be, think of that 5%. Of course, there will be a need for welfare agencies to have a role in some capacity. Let's be clever and careful and sober about where that has to happen. We don't want state intervention just for the sake of it. We don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past, creating wider, different and deeper nets, as criminologists have called it in the past. So there's one thing is to carefully set up the parameters of those new welfare options, but and so we can mitigate the risk at that point. The greater risk, I think, it comes with time, that there isn't an accidental loss of the vision of the initial framework. So I think that's one of the greater challenges I'm talking about over a period of decades into the long term. How do we maintain, how do we prevent unintended negative consequences over the long term? That relates to keeping agencies on track, and that's a harder thing to do, in my opinion.
So do we have examples from either other jurisdictions in Australia or internationally of programs that have worked well for young offenders?
Yes, lots of them. You can go to it's publicly available. You can go to the Australian Institute of Criminology website and download for free. There's at least one long report. Now, it might be, it could very well be about 15 years old, but students might be interested to see the aim of that report was simply to catalogue all of the different programs that were offered just around Australia and the evidence base of whether they're working or not. So, but let's be sober and clever about this once more, you know, thinking about this issue, because we don't want to be just saying, well, the people got lots of options, here they are, without carefully examining actually what we're talking about. There's three main points I want to make, Jan. One is that, because the question asked, what's the evidence that these are more cost effective and that they work at decreasing the incidence of crime in the community? First thing to name up, it is notoriously difficult to measure whether anything changes the rates of crime in the community, precisely because the criminal justice system only detects and prosecutes a fraction of all crime. Now, different types of crime are easier to detect and prosecute than others, but the point still stands. So that relates to a statistical issue, really, that we have a lot of missing data. And that makes, when you have small programs in small populations like Tasmania, or programs that only operate in Launceston, it makes it very much harder than the public assumes. It makes it very hard to actually measure whether they've reduced crime or not. Yep. So that's really important for policymakers to understand. What we know about programs is that although there's a wonderful variety of them out there, and I've been involved over the decades in trying to get some of them set up and running in Tassie, but the timing and the need wasn't quite right. One of them, for example, related to it was called Main Chance Farm, and it was based on a program that worked well in Canada, and it was about especially for, you know, think of that 5% for kids who are at high risk of offending, lots of issues and complexities in their life. And the Canadian program on which Main Chance Farm was based was all about the benefits for many young people in being able to just interact with animals. I mean, over a protracted period of time. It's called, like the old term would be, animal husbandry, that they can gain confidence and grow in empathy in relation to, you know, working with horses or whatever it may be. The problem is that whilst you can look around the globe and see, gee, that program works there or that works there, often the program is confined by time or space or funding or the right people. Yep. And it's really not easy just to cut and paste what works there to here. Yeah. Yeah. So just imagine that, you know, there's a program that works wonderfully in Finland that might have no relevance whatsoever to Alice Springs, and what works well in Alice Springs might be hopeless for Devonport or Hobart. So that's not as simple as we might think. Yeah. I know with a lot of these answers, I'm actually not giving that nice concrete, well, it's this, it's that. But really, the getting to address these issues is exactly the purpose of Lawfest, isn't it? Yeah. I will say that, harking back to my earlier
and we're going to have to wrap up. So just as a quick final point,
is that we do have a lot of evidence, as I mentioned, across time, and I'm talking about decades, across countries, that diversion works. And you know, the less the less that the criminal justice system has to do with the lives, especially very young offenders, the better.
I think that was a very, very loud theme in our last session as well,
Right,
that we're spending far too much on locking people up when the investment would really be better made in diversion programs that take people out of that system altogether. Let me just finish up by asking you, how optimistic are you that we will see a raising of the age of criminal responsibility? The TLRI is obviously dealing with this question. Mm-hmm. Are you hopeful? You're always hopeful.
I want to. Yes, I am. I am. I am optimistic that we can address this carefully, and we can see what works for Tassie. Because I remember I came into this topic, Jan, and as I told the students, I don't have firm views on this. I want to know more, and hopefully you guys who are listening to this will want to know more as well. So I could see that there's certainly a lot to be optimistic about why we should look at this. I think what I want is if we've really looked at it very carefully and we decide it's a good idea, then yes, I would be optimistic that government would address the change, would affect the change.
Great. Thank you so much, Jeremy. That was wonderful as usual.
You're most welcome. Thanks to all the students for listening.
We'll take a little break now for another few minutes and restart at midday with a discussion of another aspect of criminal law, which is the International Criminal Court and war crimes. So we'll join you again in another few minutes. But in the meantime, thanks so much, Jeremy, for your participation today in Lawfest.
My pleasure. Bye-bye, everyone.